Hello, podcast fans. This is Jason Burnett from the Archie Bray Foundation. Listen, we are celebrating the second birthday of our Brickyard Podcast Network with an online auction and fundraiser. 16 artists have donated work to help us raise money to support the network. If you are a fan of our podcasts, don't miss this chance to buy work from Sarah Pike, Roberta Lugo, Adrian Iliadis, Michael Klein, and many others. Every winning bid goes to support programming at the Bray. Bidding will start on the network's birthday, August 16th, and will run to August 19th. To find out more, visit us at givergy.us/thebray, brick by brick.
Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com.
Welcome back to episode 476 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I'm talking with Frank James Fisher. His work in advertising as a graphic designer and product designer has influenced his use of text and printing in his ceramic work. In this interview, we talk about his use of UV plates for printing on ceramics. It creates a really nice 3D printed surface, as well as how he's developed press molds for ultra-thin slab work. If you're interested in seeing examples of his work, you can check him out on Instagram, or you can go to frankjamesfisher.com. Before we get to that interview, I'd like to thank the folks that donate to our show. We are listener-supported, so I'd like to thank Omi Powers and Dan Finnegan for their recent contributions. If you'd like to support the show, you can do that at patreon.com/redclayrambler. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. Well, let's start talking about advertising, because that's been a parallel career for you for decades now. So can you talk about getting into advertising?
My father was in the cataloging business, and I said we're in Detroit, lots of automotive. So he had a cataloging and repair manual agency, and he would work for Ford Motor Company, and they would produce lots of and for Ford Tractor, lots and lots of catalogs. That was his mainstay. I came and started to work, and he started that in 1968, and I started working with him in 78. That was my high school job. Other kids worked at restaurants or bus tables or car washes, and I went and worked at my dad's agency. And he was very smart about it. He had planned for me to become part of the company right from the start. So each summer and each break, he would put me in a different part of the company to learn that part of the business. So it started when I was 16 years old working in there, and I worked, the lowest of the low, where you're putting paper flaps on artboards, and you have to remember back then it was that was all hard art. That was still art boards. There was no digital. It was rubber cement and galleys of type that would be glued to boards, and crop marks and overlays and Rubylith and all that sort of stuff. So it was old school, not old school like lead type, but I mean it was the old way, and rooms full of boards full of paper art and stuff. So that was my introduction, was working for him, and then moving through these different places. I started out, they called it the flap room. It was the most unglamorous room because basically you had a stack of like 500 boards on your left, and you had a stack of paper and tissue, and you rubber cemented and glued flaps on these boards for the day. And you'd come in, there'd be another stack. And that was all the artists that were keylining, and they needed to have a protective flap on these. So, and then I think in the next summer, I opaqued negatives. They shot everything in 4x5, and I would opaque the backs of the negatives and just sit at a light table and just do that for the day. And then I moved into the dark room, and they had a big copy camera, and we shot the negatives and processed them there. And I can remember spending my whole summer with, I called it rubber fingers, is you'd go through the stop bath and the fixer and all that, and you end up with these rubbery fingers that you could hardly touch anything with, But that was, I finally made it to the boards. That was the goal, is if you're an artist, you want to make it to the boards. And you're kind of like in the bullpen there with all the other artists. And I finally, after about 4 or 5 summers, I got there. And so that was my introduction.
The cataloging industry, as the car industry started to move, the need for these catalogs for parts and for other things started to go down. So that was almost like a whole form of advertising that just, I don't want to say it ended, but it kind of trickled to its end. So could you talk about watching that happen and watching also Detroit change as the car industry changed?
Sure. The cataloging business, at first it changed because it went digital. So all that stuff would, and it was a weird transition, because you had, it was like everything was done on paper. And then there was a point where they were making copy shots and scanning that. And then they were digitally working off these scans. And then you finally made the transition to, everything was done on CAD and converted over. So you still had the need for that. It just, the medium switched from paper to digital. And that was, so I worked with my father until he passed in 94. And that was cataloging. I got bored of cataloging when I was with him. I wanted to go into the marketing end, the advertising. And basically if I could make sense out of it, he was game. And we had some people that were doing brochures, some salespeople are bringing in brochures. So I got into the advertising marketing while he was still alive, probably around 1990. I started getting into that. And I would go out and get my own clients. And there was a salesman there that was kind of a mentor to me in the advertising. His name was Larry Ciancio. And he kind of took me under his wing and taught me. And we would go out and pitch accounts and win them and come back, and he would oversee the accounts. And I had moved into the creative. And so I was doing the creative on all it, whether it was advertising or logo design, just about. I was even doing some scripts, and I was doing storyboards for television commercials and things like that. So it was a great time for me. So the cataloging thing, I was kind of leaving that behind, and I was moving more into the creative. And then when my father passed, I didn't have his agency was based on his relationships. And so when he passed, it kind of became a free-for-all on the accounts. There were some internal people that kind of made a stab and play for it. I just looked after my own. I had kind of this little mini agency inside there doing the creative. So when that went, talked with my mother and they said, let's just shut it down. And then Frank, you can do your own thing. And so I went off and created my own ad agency. And that was Fisher Creative Services. And we took off. That we did incredible. I had the talent I had was insane. What basically, not to get too much into the advertising, but basically what you can edit this out, but basically what happened is my brother-in-law was an incredible salesman, and he would get the accounts, and then I'm an exceptional marketing graphic designer, and I was doing the creative, and between the two of us, we became kind of like the wunderkinds of Detroit, pulling in creative accounts that good agencies weren't able to get. We were, a lot of smoke and mirrors back then, but, we were young and dumb, and we'd run at the wall, and sometimes we'd break through. It was pretty amazing. And the awards we started winning were first regional, then national, and then international awards for the marketing. And we were creating some direct mail campaigns using techniques that hadn't ever been done before. We I'll give you an example because it ties directly into the ceramic work that I take off on, is that we had a client who wanted to get T-shirts samples to their clients, and they worked with Hanes and they worked with Lofties and all these. So they came to us and they said, we'd like to do this direct mail campaign to get a sample out to everybody. And the first campaign we came out was we created a fake movie, and it was called ZT and Me, and it was based on ET. And we put the T-shirt in a film canister, and we created a fake movie poster, and everything that was on that poster had to do with the T-shirt, but it looked like it was talking about a movie. So this whole parody thing, and I think we probably did maybe a dozen or 24 of these campaigns, and they got international attention and the awards and all that. But that whole concept of using an established imagery and using it as a facade to have a secondary message is something that I then picked up in my ceramics. Is there's a shorthand out there for speaking to people through advertising and all that. And there's buzzwords, and there's presentation, and there's a hierarchy of language and graphics. And the small type is typically the most important type, and the big type is usually the hook on any kind of graphic thing. And so all this language, these hieroglyphics almost, are the communication tools that I pulled from all this parody work that we did, and I've rolled them into my ceramics. And I've basically, I look at it as, and we can get into this more if you want, but basically when I go into my studio, I come up with a fictitious product. Let's say it's let's say you want to hide a sin. That's the product. It's not a product that you could ever buy, but in my mind, that's something a lot of people would like to buy. So I create this product called Hide a Sin, and I might not name it, but I'm going to label the product, and I'm going to create a container for it, and I'm going to create graphics that indicate what it is. And one of these I did was I used a picture of a widow on the front, and I pretended it was Hester Prynne from The Scarlet Letter. And so all the graphics on there were about, unbranding yourself, hiding a sin. And so the whole premise of that. So I basically turn myself into a client, and then I get in there and I design it and build it all out and put the graphics together, and that becomes that. So 90% of the ceramics I do, I'm working as a client with a fictitious product that could never exist or should exist or whatever, and I build it out like that. So that was kind of the connection to the advertising, but it took a long time to come to that. I mean, when I got into ceramics, it was 2000, and I was stressed with work, and I needed an outlet. And I remembered my college days of ceramics. And I took a course. This would have been 2000 with John Murphy. And I don't know if I'm jumping around. Maybe you want to.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
So I'm working with my agency. We're doing great, but the agency's getting bigger. And the bigger the agency gets, the less time I have for creative, the more time I'm bogged down with administration. And I can do administration, but I don't like it. And the reason why the agency is doing so well in a not the only reason, but a big reason is the creative that I was supplying. And if I'm pulled out of the creative end to deal with administration, it became tricky. I kept dreaming as we're getting bigger, I kept dreaming of when we were just a little hotshot agency and there was like 4 or 5 of us, and it was a little more team rather than the rest of it. So I take a ceramics class and I just lucked out. I took a course at Schoolcraft College with an instructor's name was John Murphy. I had no idea how influential this guy would be. Every time I needed a nudge in a certain direction, whether it was intentional or just happenstance, he just happened to have the right nudge. And it might have been I was receptive, whereas a lot of times when you're young, you're not. But different thing. He did slip cast molds of geometric shapes. They reminded me of automotive fenders and headlights and things like that. But first thing he showed me was stop thinking as a potter with a wheel and start thinking about what your end image, your end goal is, and find out how to get there. And I've always felt that way about art, whether I was painting or whatever, is that you envision where you want to be, and then what are the means to get there. And he showed me that. And so he showed me clay molds that he did. And I mean, what he was doing, nobody else was doing, certainly in my mind, but I just admired that foresight to just disregard any of the guidelines or rules and just go for the end result. So that was the first thing. The other thing was showed me things. He introduced me to raku firing, which was a crux in everything that I did in the beginning, and showed me things about under firing glazes and their matte and over firing, and they run, and ways to get the crackle and a lot of the stuff, but it is known. But the under firing was pivotal because I ended up creating some tea cans. That's what I call them. They're basically petroleum cans that look like they've been dug out of your granddad's garage. They're old and dated. And him introducing me to that was at the right moment, because I'd been struggling trying to do them in cone 10 and cone 6, and felt like maybe I ought to get to salt firing or whatever. And he just happened to show me that, and the penny dropped, and it's like, wow, that's the solution. But he didn't know what I'd been working on, but the timing was just right. He introduced me to artists around the area and to galleries, and helped me get into shows. He's been very important part. I know same with you. You can look back and you can see there's probably a half dozen people that if they weren't there and weren't in that position, I don't even know if I'd be in ceramics if it wasn't for John, but you certainly wouldn't be where you're at and as happy as you're at. And John's one of them.
I want to go back to something you said earlier, which is that when you were making the parody objects for these marketing campaigns, what you didn't say, but what I'm getting from this is that it's fun. Like there's a sense of humor there. It's sarcastic, depending on what the tone is and what the client wanted. But then later down the road, when you start making ceramics that in a way do reference that process, I still see that sense of humor. Like you're often setting up text that's meaning one thing in an image of a person or a pattern or something that's slightly different than the text. So there's a little bit of tension between the text and whatever the surface is. And that goes back to that sense of humor. It's like a little bit of, I don't want to say you're agitating the viewer, but you're trying to break through their understanding to teach, or not teach, but try to get them to see something in a new way. And I think that's really hard to do with text, because text is often people just read it for what it is. Like it's hard to make the leap into the next level of awareness or whatever you're trying to get them to do.
Absolutely. Text is dangerous because Well, first of all, in art, I think you got to leave a little mystery. I think you need to leave a little bit of a riddle, a little bit of vagueness, and for two reasons. One is that nobody wants to be led by the nose and taken to just one thought. And if you can leave a little mystery and you can leave a little openness, you're going to widen your market. And not everybody wants to know your exact experience as the artist. They kind of want to interpret. And if there's a little vagueness to it, that's good. So yeah, the text is it can be a crutch if you lean on it too much. The thing is, in advertising, so I'm up over 40 years of being exposed to it from the inside, is that advertising, and you can see it now more than ever, advertising is a very dangerous vehicle. There's a great concern that the wrong people are in charge of too much messaging that's out there right now. And you can see that in our social media. You can see that in everything that's going on, where the venues and the media sources that we rely on are no longer neutral, and they have their own agendas. Whether you're blue or you're red or any other color, they've got their own agendas that they're putting in, and it's tough to find that neutral. So just in that you can see it, but you can imagine from a private company end, when they're putting their words together and their messaging and that, there is no real policing of that. I consider advertising a very dangerous weapon that needs to be handled carefully. And I've maintained that I only advertise in my advertising. I will only market and advertising products that I 100% believe in. I've had chances to work for accounts back before cigarettes were as bad as they were, and just wouldn't flat out do it. I don't care what the paycheck is. And I don't want to make it sound like a righteous sort of thing, but you got to sleep at night. And you know that if you just spent 8 hours in the office to help somebody become worse than they are, it's just not a good feeling. So the parodies that we did were innocent fun when I was younger, and I still do those on occasion with clients now, but the stuff that I'm doing now, the work, the art that I'm doing now, usually has a little sinister message to it. There's a little bit of warning hidden in there. And I don't want people to take things too serious that I do. Mostly, I kind of just want to bring them to people's attention that this might be something to think about or to talk about. Not taking a side, but hey, here's something. And then some of them are just straight up human condition. This is what life's like, and a little reminder that we're not all perfect, and it's good to have a little sense of humor, whether it's at a Monty Python level or if it's at a more blunt level.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Hi, I'm Greg, supervisor of crude clay production at Amoco. We are proud to supply clay for your studio or classroom. This episode is brought to you by Amoco Brent. Find Amoco clay, glazes, and equipment at your local Amoco distributor.
Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfeld Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of thousands of objects made by over 800 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfeldcollection.com.
One of the ways that you've developed to put text onto work and just to put imagery is to use solar printing. Or how do you describe it? Is it solar? What term would you use for this technique?
Would be UV printing, because it is, you can do it with the sun. So then technically you're hardening the plate with the sun, but you can also use UV lights to expose and harden it.
Can you describe why that works so well with print or anything that has a fine edge quality?
So this goes back to my advertising and working with printing plates and brochures, advertising, anything that we would produce. I would have to go out and do press checks where you actually go to the printing firms and that. And so anything I'm designing in my advertising career, there would involve print plates, and there's different kinds. There's the modern kind, which are basically work on almost a resist sort of transfer of ink off a print blanket, and that, to the older kind, which is like kind of that rubber stamp where it's actually the dimensional cutout. And I was reading an issue of Pottery Making Illustrated, and Paul Wanless was talking about a solar plates that he used, and he learned it from somebody else. But he was putting forth this method, and in simplest terms, you create a film negative, actual size to what you want, and you lay it on top of the UV unexposed UV plate, expose it to UV light, whether it's the sun or you have a UV box for a duration based on the strength of the light. And then you wash away anything that wasn't exposed in the sink. So the exposed part gets hardened, and the rest of it that's hidden by the black of the negative washes away. So you've got that dimensional raised area. Why it's so great for hard lines and all that is that print plate works by it either being there or not there. It's a black white sort of situation. So there is no soft transitions or anything like that. It's either there or not there. And that for me was always a very comfortable area because I did so much logo design and and some illustration. You can go back to my catalog days. There was lots of technical illustration that I did and was involved with, where it's just line art with rapidograph pens and that. But logo design is a real comfort zone for me. So the solar plates are ideal because a logo needs to work in one color, black, white. So it's just an ideal material. So then you can push the clay into that, and you get that dimensional, impression that gives you a place to separate. A glaze can go in there, and underglaze can go into that recessed area, and then that higher ground, you can wipe that clean, and you get a real sharp edge there. Yeah. So you can do illustration, you can do type, you can do whatever you want.
Back in probably 2000 or so, right around then, I was doing a project in undergrad with Tom Spleth, who was the one that taught me about this solar plate technology. And I did a whole body of work with it. And at the end, I hated it. Like, it's funny. It's not that I hated the plate, is that I couldn't relate to the process. So I love the idea that as someone in advertising, this was actually an extension of what you were already doing. Like, this was,
yes,
in a way, like, this is your playing field. And I think you can see that on the work, that the way you move around imagery and text on the work is in a way similar to moving around the physical images and text that you did way back in the day when you were gluing them onto artboards.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Now, my beginnings in ceramics were in high school. I took a survey course, and I think we spent 4 weeks in the clay lab, and we did a gigantic slab built letter, which was always everybody's first letter of their name. And then I just badgered the teacher to let me sit on the wheel. And so I sat on the wheel, and I made the most horrific pile of crud that you've ever seen. I think by the time I got it down, it was probably 2 inches tall, and there was so much grog exposed. It was like a cactus. And I insisted that she run it. We fired it and all that, and it was hideous. I was done with clay. I didn't want to see clay again. my dad says, Frank, you got to get back into clay. He knew I did a lot of model making, plastic models, and that as a kid, that was, in the 70s, that was kind of the thing you did. You made your monster models and tank models and plane models. He knew I liked the 3D. So when I went to college, my dad said, so you got to take a clay class, Frank. I think you need to take clay class. So first semester I signed up, and like everybody says, I was hooked. It's like an addiction. It feels so natural, so right. So every semester till I graduated, which I went 4.5 years, I studied with Jay Shirtliff, and that's all I did is just I took one clay course. He thought I was going to be a major in it, and I ended up being a Bachelor of Fine Arts in graphic design. But he thought, and I felt bad about that, but I had this job waiting for me that I'd been groomed for all my high school and college years. And I knew there was good money in it. And I knew that this would have been early 80s. There wasn't a lot of money in clay and ceramics. And not that there wasn't enough, but I knew that I would be living near my parents. So I knew what kind of money you needed to have to live in Milford Commerce area, and I wanted a family, and there was this job waiting. My father was a painter, and he would work in advertising, and then he would paint on the side. So growing up, being an artist basically meant you had a steady job, and on the side, you did your true love. And so when I graduated from college, that was basically the family tradition. I'll step into the family business, and I'll do art on the side. I went into painting because I knew how expensive it would be to start a clay studio. So I went into, and painting and illustration go akin with advertising and marketing. So as I got into the advertising, I just switched full on to oil painting and watercolor and gouache, and I did a lot of illustration work throughout my career. Did car calendars for Ford and things like that. It was a fun, exciting thing. It's funny because when I grew up, I thought I'd be a comic book artist before I knew about anything. So, I have a strong background in comic art and comics, and that not much as far as being published or anything, but that was, and I think that's probably every kid's dream at some point, is to do that.
Well, I'm glad you brought up comics because I wanted to ask some of the work uses the language of comics in terms of the cells, like that there'll be storylines broken up into small sections. And then there'll also be kind of large text elements that are like the thought bubble, which
Yes.
is like a classic part of comics. But in clay, it's nice because you can have, a flat sort of slab-built vessel, but you're implying depth into the surface. So one of the things I'd like to hear about is like, how do you make things that don't just look flat? Because clay often, if you just print with these solar plates and just do nothing, it's going to look flat as a board. So how do you build depth through your process?
If you look at comic art, it's all about a narrative, and it's pushed along by imagery. And if you look at advertising, it's the same exact thing. There's a narrative, and it's pushed along by advertising. And now when I'm growing up, I'm making models, plastic models and stuff like that. And there's an interesting parallel with sculpture and 3D work and the narrative story is that if you look at a typical comic strip, you have panel 1 kind of sets up the premise, and then you go to the panel 2, it gives you more detail, and panel 3 and panel 4, and you finally get the reveal. There's a narrative progress. Same thing happens with advertising. There's a hierarchy there that you start at the top left-hand corner, and you work your way down the page to the right. And there's large images and smaller images, and there's your headline and your body copy and your tagline and your logo and all these. There's kind of this introduction and then a final payoff. Same thing happens in my mind when I look at a ceramic vessel, because I've got all flat planes. Is there's a primary panel, which is the front, and that's in package design, which I do a lot of in my marketing career. There's your primary panel and your secondary panels, and then your information panels and all that. Well, I break down the bottle the same way. I look at the front of the bottle as my primary panel, and that kind of is my introductory, just like on product packaging, that kind of catches it. And then if you wanted to follow that narrative, typically the back is the second panel of a strip, and then the sides are kind of the supportive panels, and that, and between the front and the back, you kind of have your introduction of the premise, and the back is kind of the payoff. So I kind of look at, and that all kind of goes back to, I see a parallel when I would build these model kits. So silly as this sounds, is that if I was going to build a Frankenstein model kit as a 12-year-old boy, I had to also build a diorama with it. And that would be like the stage setting for it. So I'd make this plastic kit and I'd paint it all up and I'd have the diorama. There's always a primary viewpoint with a sculpture or with a model kit or whatever. And as you work your way around it 360, you get more and more reveal, and more of the story can be told. So the primary visual, like on a bottle, will be your introduction. And then as you work your way out, more information is revealed to tell the narrative of the story. The same thing works with a sculpture. Many sculptures, especially like some of the old Roman sculptures and that marble sculptures, you have a primary view, and as you work your way around, you can see more characters and more information revealed in that. So that's kind of how I look at it. And I bend the rules, but it's that way.
Yeah, and because some of the objects are functional, like the flasks, the bottles you were talking about, the person's going to literally grasp the surface. So they're going to feel text on their finger. They're going to feel the image, whatever the image is. And then if they're drinking out of it, they're going to pull it to their mouth, which means the distance between the object and them changes. And I think that's really nice when you have really small elements. Because I noticed, like you mentioned in advertising, the small text is the important thing and the big text is the hook. I see that on the pots too. There'll often be really small elements that you'd have to, hold that thing up to be able to see it.
Yes.
And I think that's like the power of pots, is that the user manipulates them, and then the pot in turn manipulates the person's perception.
And you can kind of picture, if I had stayed on my painting career and I had adopted this whole premise, what a failure that approach would be. You really need, exactly as you described, you need to pick it up, interact with it, and learn, and be able to hold it up close. If you saw that all at one time, two-dimensional, just like you did with an ad, that slow reveal would be that much weaker. But I like the fact that you got to interact and pick it up, and you get surprised on the back. There are pieces too that I've introduced a QR code to into the clay, and that kind of takes it one more. It's like you get your first introduction to the narrative there, and then you flip it around. There's a QR code. You put your phone up to it and scan it, and all of a sudden you're on a web page, and it's telling you even more of the story. So I like that reveal, that slow reveal, and the delay and the interaction. That there was another thing I like doing. I don't mean to ramble on, but there's another thing I like to do is I liked making my pieces extra thin. And because potters love to pick things up, and there's a wonderful reaction, if I can be there, when somebody picks one of my pieces up for the first time, because it's so light. So they immediately go and they pick it up, and they know it's clay. And they pick it up, and it's so light. It's like, what is this, aluminum? No, so there's the fact that you interact with it gives you all these extra opportunities to add more to the event. And yeah, I just, to me, it's the ideal medium.
Well, a great example of that thinness is actually the paper airplanes, the sculptures of paper airplanes that you've done. And I wanted to talk about that, just your interest in the object, but also the mold system you made for those. The molds are beautiful. Like I feel like actually I was looking at kind of a progression of your molds, and the last thing you got to, that could be a sculpture. So could you talk a little bit about what the meaning of those is?
I've been doing more and more collabs with people, and my brother is a painter, and so we're on the phone, and we still haven't figured out what we're going to do together, but we want to do something together. And he was talking about these paper hats that he had done for a show in New York, and it just like it's like one of those eureka moments where there's like 5 pennies that all drop, and I just, oh my God, I got to do paper planes. And so that was, I have to credit him with where it all started. And immediately it's a trompe l'oeil thing. It's got to look like a newspaper and all that sort of stuff. And I tried using my porcelain clay, and I couldn't get that to work. I ended up with like 4 pieces. The wings would snap off, and I was raku firing them at that point too. So I was doing some evil things to the clay that it just shouldn't be done. And I had sat into a workshop once with Lana Wilson, and she talked about paper clay, and that thought never left me. And then Tim Kowalczyk and I did a collab, and he sent me some of his clay, and he warned me that a lot of people don't like it. And so I tried it. Frickin' A, man, I like that stuff. He had such paper thin pieces, and I thought, Eureka, this is it, And so, I found a clay body, tried some different clay bodies, and I found one out of aardvark that I use regularly now. And that's amazing. So what I discovered is when I was rakuing them, they were all kind of a lower fire, and there would be no sag to the clay. I know you do this, Ben. You come up with an idea and you get it figured out, but you can't leave it alone. You got to make it more complicated and more complicated and more complicated.
You have to add suffering.
Yeah, I do. And I just doused this with suffering. So the progression was the simplest mold was just made out of cardboard in the beginning, and I'd cover it with a piece of plastic so it won't warp or won't get soggy. And then I made one out of wood. And then I said, I can do better than that. I can combine wood with metal. And these are slump molds. So basically, I'm just rolling out a sheet of clay that's flat, doing all my graphics, and then I just slump it, tuck it in to do that. Then I get into underglazes, and I'm adding underglazes, and then I'm adding camouflage patterns, and then I'm printing on them I put them I get the paper clay, and I do the slump mold, and I get them through my bisque, and everything's fine. And then I put it to cone 5, which is where this clay is supposed to be at. And the wings go flat. Now, everybody in the family says that don't matter, but I wanted that little sort of gull wing, so it's not sitting flat on there. I wanted that little bit of raise on the wings there. So you had the fuselage and you had the wings. So that's where the molds that you've seen, I have similar molds that are made out of clay that I actually fire them on. They're like little platforms to keep those inverted. But yeah, that mold making, the slump molds, and then I kept wanting to make them bigger. I think I can get them up to about almost 2 feet big now, 2 feet long.
Oh, wow.
As far as there, but they take about a month to do. So I don't do very many of them. They kind of have something I work on in the background. But yeah, and I have a table saw, and I'm pretty good at woodworking and all that. So the molds actually become, a work of art. They're a point of pride. And you're making this stuff, and nobody's going to see it, but at the same time, there's a bit of pride you want to have in it. And then one day I was looking at it, and I was running out of room because they're stacked up on the floor of my studio over in the corner, and it's like, those are kind of cool. So I did lay them all out and show the evolution of these molds that I've made.
I wanted to end our conversation talking about pricing. So in your advertising career, you're worth a lot of money. So like your creative ideas can generate money for you, it can generate money for the client. But then when you're working in clay, this is your time. Like you've described it as like, this is your passion, this is your thing. But it's still time. Like you're still putting a lot of time. And I know that your decorative process is really labor intensive. I think I heard you say that sometimes it'll take months to finish glazing something. How do you determine the financial value of your objects relative to your advertising career and the time you spend in the clay studio?
It won't add up. It doesn't add up. I think this is probably the problem that all of us have until you reach a certain level. And I'm fairly calculated the way I've approached my career in clay. Now, I probably made about 1,000 flasks. I was trying to figure that out. Probably 800 to 1,000 flasks. As I get more into it, I get faster and faster at doing it. And I know a lot of shortcuts, and I know a lot that I would have lost in the beginning that I can still save. And I can kind of do an assembly line, and I can do them in batches of 10. So there's some economies there. I sell them now for between $190 and $220. And if it's a gallery situation, you can cut that in half. So about $100. Those I'm doing pretty good on. I think that's fair pay for what I'm doing. If you're looking at $20 an hour, I'm doing real good on the gallery ones. And I'm not counting like kiln timing and stuff like that, but and the materials are so, I work fairly thin. So a bag of clay lasts me several months. So it's not like I'm burning through those. So the flasks I do real good at. And those are kind of like, those are similar to what a normal artist would use a mug. That's kind of their introductory. That's kind of their common denominator. So those are my flasks. That is kind of also like my business card out there. That's kind of like, something that gets my name out. I can get more of those out there to galleries and stuff like that. I typically don't work just to fill a showroom. I typically have a couple of shows in mind that I'm working, and my goal is to make more of a presence, a splash with my work than to generate money that nobody knows about. So I don't know if that makes sense. So I would dedicate more of my time to being in a show where my name is publicized, my work is seen by more, than to be reliant on social media and having an Etsy account. I fortunately have two jobs. I have my clay job and I have my marketing job. So my approach to clay is it has to pay for itself. Plus, it doesn't have to feed the family. It doesn't have to do anything else, but it just has to pay for itself. And I usually come out, I usually reveal numbers. I'm usually somewhere around 15 to 20,000 a year. And I probably got about 5,000 overhead in that. So I'm not making big bank, but I'm moving forward. Now I'm getting close to retirement age. So my goal is to move into clay full time. So in my long-term plan, where I'm looking at now is what are the moves that I can make that can be the most influential for when I go full time, that I can do that. And basically is I need to get to a good level of gallery representation, and I have to get larger amount of money for the pieces, and the pieces are going to have to be bigger, and they're going to have to be more important. So if you kind of went through my Instagram, you can see flask, maybe a bowl here or there. And then there'll be what I would call kind of a more pivotal piece. I'm got one in the kiln right now. It's a house. I did a cloud a little while ago. I've got some of these large airplanes. So the next step is to get to that next level to where I have maybe 2 or 3 pieces in a mid to larger gallery, and they're getting some decent money. And then I'm still producing the smaller stuff, but that's my next goal is to be more like that. I will go nuts if I just keep doing the small stuff. I feel like the small stuff has been a training ground to do something more impactful. I want to be at a point where you walk into a room and you scan it and your eye stops on what I have hanging on the wall or on a pedestal. I don't want you to have to go get up close and search and find my stuff. I want it to be more like, and that probably goes back to my painting career and paintings on the wall, and and in advertising, you scan the room and the shelves, and the product that stops you is the most impactful. It's the one that attracts you. There's that's an influence that just is like ingrained in me. Though I would like to add one thing too, and you can work this in, is that the transition to what I'm doing now was more or less a denial phase for a long time. When I came out of college, I went into advertising, and when I went back into ceramics in 2000, John Glick was by us, and I would visit his studio. He didn't know who I was, but he had kind of a situation we could open this. It was an open studio, and that his artwork, his studio setup, the way his whole process was, I fell in love with everything that came out of there. That was who I wanted to be. Man, I looked at that. I want to be John Glick. The way he invented things, the tools, the process. He had ways of stamping things with sponge to get textures and patterns and stuff like that. And it was all functional, which I had left a studio situation where functional was the real ceramics. Anything that was non-functional, those were oddballs. Those were odd people making weird stuff. But you were going to be a potter, your stuff was going to be functional. So that I spent probably a year and a half trying to be John Glick. And I would work my day job, and I'd go home, and I'd be making teapots and mugs and cups and bowls, and what I noticed is that everything kind of looked like a bad imitation or a bastardization of what he was doing. And it didn't feel like it was my work. It felt like I was trying to measure up to this. And what I realized is that basically I could never be him because I missed all his formative stuff. And I could never be him because I'm not him. I had to find myself. And I was into teapots big time. And lots and lots of teapots. They nicknamed me Teapot Frank at the studio. And just that was all I did. And I was at a rummage or an antique fair, and there was these old gas cans sitting there. And I looked at them, and I like antiques and stuff, so I kind of liked them. And they had some cool graphics, so that sort of appealed to me. And as I was looking at the thing, I said, "Dang, that's basically a gigantic teapot. It's got the spout, it's got the lid, it's got the belly, place for the handle, and all that." That was the transition part that kind of nudged me out, that I thought, let's put the graphics on it. And I remember John Murphy and the low fire raku things and all. That was like 2 years of trying to of battering my head against this John Glick. I would go into, at one point where I go into the studio, and I would just say, don't be a Glick, don't be a Glick, don't, because that's what I would do. I would just defer to him. It was like a black hole that I was circling. And I knew if I went in there, I'd still be doing it today. But I managed to step aside. And that would be, when I taught at Schoolcraft, I ended up teaching at Schoolcraft for 6 years in the evenings, is that would be my thing. Was each student, I would try to find out their background, their life, what they did. What is it that you can tap into yourself. What skills, what loves, what passions do you have that can come into clay? And I think that's probably the hardest part that any of us have to do is to step away from the mentors and actually look deep inside. And one of the best things that I did is when I started working from home is nobody could see what I was doing. So nobody could see my screw ups. Nobody could see the stupidness that I was doing. And every once in a while I'd bring something in and we'd fire it and whatever. But that finding yourself is the hardest part of the whole thing.
Well, I think your experience is often what happens is that you find yourself where you're already at. Like it was the advertising that was the springboard for the visual language on clay, which makes
Absolutely.
sense. Like you didn't have to invent that. That was already in you.
Yeah, I was fighting it. I was pushing it down. I was trying to step away from it. What are you doing that for? That doesn't look like what John would do. Glick wouldn't do something like that. That's not a beautiful teapot, And there's a point there where you can just kind of let go and experiment, and God knows what comes out of it. But yeah.
To wrap up, can you plug your website and also social media so people could get in touch if they'd like to?
My Instagram site is Frank James Fisher, and my website is www.frankjamesfisher.com.
Can you plug anything that you have coming up?
Absolutely. First, I got to thank Nick Duxbury. He's got a show coming up over in England at Wolverhampton Art Gallery. It's called Pop Art and Pottery. That opens October 14th. That's going to be an amazing show. I think he's pulling things from all over the world, and he's mixing them in with Wolverhampton's art collection. They got an incredible pop art collection there, and it's going to be side by side. So I think that'll be a great show. And then I have to thank Betsy Morningstar, Tim Kowalczyk, and Yossi Fuji at Baltimore Clay Works. There's the generosity in the clay community is amazing. Betsy and Tim were all set for a show, and they asked Yoshi if they could include me. And that doesn't happen in other art fields. That just doesn't happen. You get if you're in a 2-man show, you're thinking, why can't it be a 1-man show? If you're, on a 3-person show, and if you're in a 1-man show, you never want to invite. In all my years in painting and galleries and all, that never happened. And here are 2 individuals that say, hey, do you mind if we squeeze one more guy in? So we have a show coming up January 13th at Baltimore Clay Works. It's called This Is Not Paper. And if you like all the faux paper stuff, this is going to be a place you're going to want to stop, because we're going to get a little crazy with making clay look like paper.
Well, thanks so much. This has been a blast. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. I truly appreciate it. Yeah, I've listened to you all the time. So in the advertising community down the hall, you can hear your voice soothing all the anxiety at my where I work. So
I love that we've infiltrated the advertising place with craft.
Yes, yeah, it's elevated it a bit. Yeah.
Nice. Well, thanks, man.
Thank you, Ben.
I'd like to thank Frank for coming on the show. It was a pleasure to chat with him and to learn more about his work. Also wanted to take a minute and plug the second birthday celebration that we're getting ready to have for the Brickyard Network. This is going to be an online auction and fundraiser to help support the network. And we have work that's been donated by folks like Juan Barroso, Eric Botbull, Chosani Elaine Dean, Forrest Middleton, Sarah Pike, Masa Sasaki, and on and on and on. We've got 16 artists, so a bunch of folks have donated work. And you can bid on the work that they've donated August the 16th through the 18th, and that is on our Givergy site. So if you're interested in participating, you can look in the show notes. There will be a link there. You can click on that and bid on this wonderful work that people have donated. As always, if you just want to support this network, you can make a donation straight to the Archie Bray Foundation. That is our parent company, so a big thanks to them as well as our other sponsors, Amoco Brent and the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. If you or your organization is interested in sponsoring an episode of this show, you can get in touch through our network website. That's brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in.
If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.